Welcome to APUSH. In today's video, welcome to APUSH. So far in these videos, we've been focusing mostly on Native Americans, but today it's time to bring the Europeans into the picture and have stuff really start going down. So, your goals for today are these. Take a moment to pause and take them in. And without further ado, let's dive in and talk about what the Europeans wanted and where they were going and why they were going there. So, So, the goal of European explorers was multifold. In the simplest sense, they were somewhat trying to recreate the Silk Road trade with Asia, or trying to find more accurately, trying to find a better way to. Okay, so what were European explorers after? European explorers were trying to tap into an Asian trade network. Of course, you know that Asian trade has been around since, the Han Dynasty, when the Chinese and the Romans traded across the quote unquote Silk Road. But a variety of things reinvigorated Europe's interest in trade in the 13 and 1400s, leading to the quote unquote Age of Exploration, which we're going to be talking about somewhat extensively today. So, what kicked off the Age of Exploration? Well, part of it was the Pax Mongolica. You probably have never heard of the Pax Mongolica because the Mongols tend to get written out of our histories for a variety of different reasons, but the Mongols are pretty important to world history. So, here's the world in 1200. Here's the world in 1300. See if you could see some differences there, right around the Transoxiana, sort of Eurasia area. That's right, they're all controlled by the Mongols. So, what does this mean for Europeans, and how did this kick off European exploration? A couple different reasons. One, the Mongols were, of course, very interested in trade because they could tax it. Secondarily, so that opened up trade between Europe and China, which had been somewhat disrupted in the years after the fall of the Tang Dynasty, when there was a lot of sort of disunity in that part of the world. Mongols, of course, conquered all of these areas, opening them up to trade, but they also welcomed in foreign administrators because the Mongols were trying to rule over sort of diverse subject peoples. And if they could bring in foreigners to help them rule, they both would gain the expertise that the foreigners brought in, but then also wouldn't have to rely on, for example, in China, the Han Chinese population that wasn't overly thrilled to have been conquered by Mongols. So that brings us to Marco Polo, who wrote a book that was incredibly influential, the life and travels of Marco Polo, which talk about his amazing adventures in the court of Kublai Khan, who was the ruler of the Yuan dynasty. It's theorized that a lot of it was made up. There's even some people who argue that Marco Polo never went to China, but honestly, whether or not Marco Polo went to China is utterly irrelevant because he did get Europeans more interested in trade with China because of his descriptions of the opulent court of Kublai Khan. So here's the book of Marco Polo the Venetian, which may or may not be filled with lies, but got Europeans very, very excited about getting to the East. The problem with Europeans getting to Asian trade is Asian trade at this point was controlled by trade throughout the Indian Ocean, which is guided by a series of weather patterns known as monsoons. Hopefully, you covered this in world history, but if not, just a quick refresher. So, this trade, if it was going to get to Europe, had to go through sort of Eurasia here, which during this point was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire made a ridiculous amount of money operating as a middleman between Asia and Europe. So, if Europeans wanted to get these goods more cheaply, if they could cut out the Ottoman Empire and then sell the goods without having to pay the relatively high markups that the Ottomans demanded. So they could reopen Silk Road trade or tap into existing networks and get the spices and the tea and the silk and all of the really valuable Asian goods that could fetch a very high price in Europe. The early years of European exploration was dominated by two countries that we don't usually think of as being important or central to the narrative, Portugal and Spain. So, why were they leaders in European exploration? A couple different reasons. One was the Reconquista. Spain had been under Muslim control since the original conquest of the Umayyad Caliphate back in the 600s. But a couple of Christian kingdoms emerged, slowly pushed the Muslims back, and reunified Spain and Portugal as Christian kingdoms, and they became two of the first nation states in Europe, leading the kings and queens of Spain and Portugal to have significant power to tax and the ability to fund these sort of voyages. The other advantage that they got from having been controlled by Muslims for several hundred years was that they had access to Muslim technology, like the lateen sail, which allows you to tack against the wind and prevents ships from being sort of becalmed as easily. And they also got a variety of different technologies that have been um, passed through trade routes from Asia and through the Muslim world. And so, with these new technologies, you get these new ships, the caravels, with significantly better navigational technology, which allows Europeans to expand their sort of naval reach out beyond their sort of comfortable known waters. So, the Portuguese and Spanish kick off this basic competition to try to develop new trade routes and to perhaps displace the Venetians and the Ottomans for their in the business of Eurasian trade. Most famous in this process was Henry the Navigator, who was a prince of Portugal who set up a school for navigation, and so the Portuguese had an early head start in this whole process. We're going to go through these explorers relatively quickly and then later come back and talk about the implications of their voyages in more depth. So, unfortunately, this is going to be far too rapid fire. So, Bartholomew Diaz, here he is. He was able to chart a course around the Cape of Good Hope and was the first European to see the Indian Ocean after going around Africa. The Portuguese established several refueling and sort of outposts along the coast of Africa. This led the Portuguese to dominate the attempt to go around Africa to get into the Indian Ocean. Christopher Columbus is the second one of these explorers to have a major breakthrough. You, of course, learned about Columbus in elementary school, and hopefully the documents will shed more light on him. But, Venetian tried to sail for Portugal. They didn't care. King and Queen of Spain, Isabella and Ferdinand, recently consolidated their throne, gave him a couple ships. Here he is. And his plan, of course, was to sail west to cross the Atlantic Ocean and reach China. Columbus's problem was he underestimated the size of the world by about a third, and basically that's the reason that no one else would finance his voyages. Is they're like, Columbus, your math is off. You're going to die somewhere in the middle of this massive ocean. There's no way you can get there. But Columbus was utterly convinced that his math was correct and that he was smarter than everyone else. So he travels west and discovers this new world, which he, of course, thought was islands off the coast of China. From this, we have the first European accounts of contact with Native Americans. So pause and take a gander at Columbus's somewhat ignorant and racist descriptions of Native Americans. So here's Columbus meeting some Native Americans and, getting gifts, and Native Americans fleeing in terror, and there was some significant enslavement and mistreatment. And again, we'll come back to this later. Columbus had 4 voyages, but these voyages aren't what is specifically important about Columbus. What's important about Columbus is by connecting the North American continents to Europe, Africa, and Asia, he kicked off what is known as the Columbian Exchange. Pause and try to take all this in. I know you covered this in world history, but the exchange of these plants and animals from the American continents to Europe and Africa is incredibly important because, of course, it's going to transform life in all these places. In Europe, crops like potatoes and peppers and tobacco, honestly, mostly potatoes, quite frankly, allow Europeans to grow crops in areas where they couldn't before, allowing populations to explode. In the Americas, livestock is going to be a huge deal, and disease is going to play an outsized role in our story from this point going forward. So there's the Columbian Exchange. Hopefully you remember it from world history. Moving on. Vasco da Gama was Portuguese, and he was the one to sail all the way around Africa and reach India, setting up again outposts there that the Portuguese would dominate for a time before being displaced by other more important powers. And you've got Ferdinand Magellan, who's the first human to circumnavigate the globe, or more accurately, his men were the first men to circumnavigate the globe because, of course, as you hopefully remember from that DBQ in world history, Magellan himself was killed trying to convert the Filipinos to Christianity, which apparently they did not appreciate. So, of course, Magellan's men get back to Spain, and the Spanish get the glory of being the first to circumnavigate the globe and, get to claim the Philippines, which will have a variety of impacts further on. Then you've got some Northern European explorers. They were super late to the game. In the early years, it was all just like piracy and things like that, and we'll talk more about that later. But you get Cabot from England, who sailed and charted some of Canada, giving England some early claims in North America. Samuel de Champlain, who charted the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River, giving the French a foothold in North America. And finally, Henry Hudson, who sailed for both the Dutch and later the British, giving his name to a river and a bay that you may be familiar with. You don't need to specifically know any of these people, but you do need to know that the British, the French, and the Dutch all got in the colonization/claiming business of land that was already occupied by Native Americans. And so they're going to be important powers going forward as the European countries start to squabble about who's going to occupy this already occupied land. So there's your quick rundown of explorers. Hopefully you'll be able to answer these questions at least somewhat extensively. And when we come back, we'll start looking more intently at the impact of all of these voyages, especially the impact on the people who were already living on these lands that the Europeans are now claiming for their own.